and welcome to yet another episode of Focus On with myself, Palisa Mufiking. We are still in Davos where the World Economic Forum meetings have been taking place. Standard Bank has been supporting South Africa's and Africa's infrastructure narrative and showcasing its economic reforms. Let's take a look. Lovia, thank you so much for your time. Just for a start, I'm sure you have been participating in quite a number of discussions, panel discussions. What has been the key highlight for you?
No, thank you very much, Palisa. WEF takes place at a time that's very interesting, both from a geopolitical perspective. But when I bring it home, it's a year that South Africa takes charge of, the chairmanship of the G20. And so one of the things that we've definitely been noticing at this WEF is just the presence of South Africa and Africa agenda specifically. With the highlight obviously being our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, being the first African president to address a conference. So that's been one aspect that's been very clear. The other has been also a big focus on growth, and that growth in a manner that is sustainable, but also inclusive. And so there's been a lot of focus around growth and collaboration.
And speaking on growth, let's bring in infrastructure, which is a key area that is key in advancing the African continent. And we do know that the African continent is capital hungry for infrastructure financing, infrastructure development. How are you as Standard Bank responding to this?
Yeah, firstly, our response is also anchored on our purpose as a bank. Africa is our home with driver growth. And we identify the benefits of investing in infrastructure, it as a catalyst to good and sustainable economic growth. And therefore, we've set ourselves, an aspiration to be the funder of this infrastructure that we'll see on the continent on two fronts. One, using our own balance sheet. But the balance sheet and the capital that exists on the continent is insufficient to satisfy this infrastructure need. And therefore, our role in mobilizing some of this capital, accessing capital pools across outside of the continent, providing structures that are innovative in order to bring down the cost of financing this infrastructure, which has been one of the biggest inhibitors historically.
Let's talk about South Africa's risk element when it comes to infrastructure. What has been the response from the broader investment community, in fact, here to that? Is the appetite to invest in Africa's infrastructure development?
Absolutely. I think there's a first recognition is that Africa is not homogeneous. It's made up of many different countries, over 50, with different starting points, different challenges, different opportunities, and different needs. So that's been a very important step. Secondly, there's definitely appetite to deploy capital for the right projects that are structured appropriately and are bankable, which has been one of the challenges that we've seen historically that has stopped capital flowing in. Lastly, the policy environment has to be one that is very clear, transparent, so that people can make capital allocation decisions. As you know, infrastructure is long-term. And so in order to attract capital, you need to provide an environment that is enabling for that capital. But there's no doubt that there's appetite for capital to be deployed in Africa for the right projects.
And how much would you say you're targeting just in terms of the capital investments for Africa's infrastructure?
Well, firstly, there is a massive gap of over $100 billion per annum just to catch up. When you consider all aspects of infrastructure, there's a gap of 3.4 trillion. And so the gap is massive. The trick, though, is to start and to identify the most urgent things that we need to do, and the right projects, and bring those up to speed and get runs on the board, as they say. But I think success will bring success in this, and approach this one small step at a time.
Okay, and just before I let you go, we do know that you are hosting your thematic roundtable discussion this morning. Just take us through some of the key highlights and key takeaways.
Yeah, one of the key highlights, and I've shared it with some of my panelists, is I talk about this gap and this opportunity and what has not been done. It's also very important to recognize a lot has been done. when you consider the participation of the DFIs, some of the projects we've seen, for example, in South Africa, if you consider our response to the energy challenges that we face, and the setting up of the the renewable energy IPP program, which has been critical, and we've seen a flow of capital, and it's a perfect example of how a private public partnership can work. And so I walk out of here hopeful, but lots of work to be done. But the sense I also got is that Africa is open for business.
Just for a start, let's talk about Africa's presence at this year's WEF.
It couldn't be more different, actually. If we look at the difference between last year and this year, Africa was noticeable by its absence last year, and the message we were trying to give at that point in time was attracting capital to Africa. A lot's changed in the intervening period. Predominantly, and bringing a lot of attention to Africa this year, is the presence of the government of South Africa in their new role with the presidency of the leadership of the presidency of the G20 and B20 coming to Africa for the first time, and President Ramaphosa being here. That has meant that we've had a big delegation of ministers. It's attracted a big business interest as well. And rather than the generality of attracting capital to Africa, the conversation has been much more about infrastructure and the needs that the African continent has.
And just to expand a little bit more on infrastructure, what's your overview or your take of Africa's infrastructure picture?
It's essential to the economies. It's essential to trade. The African Continental Free Trade Area has finally got all the African countries as signatories to it. The issue that we face now is the friction within the countries, within the continent, and even coming into the continent. And they're largely infrastructure based. When you think about the roads, where 80% of African trade is conducted, or less than 50% of the roads in Africa are paved. The rolling stock and rail infrastructure is in deficit as well. It's the needs of the continent are probably 4 times the existing infrastructure, rail infrastructure. And in addition, there needs to be a standardization of the gauge of the rail as well. And this has presented a big opportunity. One can look at it as a deficit, but it also needs significant amount of capital. There's an estimate that $3.4 trillion worth of capital is needed to get Africa's infrastructure where it needs to be. And if you put that on an annual basis, it's $100 billion a year. There's no way the continent on its own can fund that if you look at the size of the economies.
And speak to me about some of the opportunity sectors and where you are seeing these opportunities as far as the African continent is concerned.
Okay. Well, in the general, as I said, infrastructure opportunities are significant. We've done 3 events over the course of the last 4 months, one in South Africa, one in London with a ministerial delegation from Africa, and one here at Davos at the World Economic Forum. Each of those was focused on infrastructure. We have found multilateral agencies interested in participating in those conferences. We found other financial institutions that are interested, big infrastructure funds, and then the companies themselves that are prepared to partner with African governments. And I think that's where the opportunity mostly lies. Whereas many countries in Africa have felt traditionally that it is the single responsibility of the government, it's now moving to an open-mindedness with regard to private partnership. The average government spend globally on infrastructure as a percentage of GDP is 14%. In Africa, that's 4%. So there's a significant amount of investment needed. So whether it's ports, whether it's road, whether it's rail, whether it's other physical infrastructure like bridges, and indeed water, there are a lot of different areas, and there are segments of the global economy covering each of those which are happy to participate.
And that's it from me, Bolisa Mufukeng. Until next time, it's goodbye for now.